All right, so let's get serious. Let's get real.
Oh, this is pretty serious.
The EU has filed antitrust charges against Google's Android OS with a focus on how Google requires OEMs to agree to the placement of its services and its apps on installations of Android. In question is the fact that OEMs who agree to roll with Google's brand of Android are forced to comply with an order that prevents them from releasing an Android fork on any of its other devices. As well, services that come bundled with Android, they say, hinder competition from others who are offering similar services. That's according to the EU. They also have issues with kind of the financial incentives behind all of this, how Google kind of gives, I guess kicks down some incentives to manufacturers or carriers who exclusively pre-install Google search on its devices. So, and by the way, this is not the first time we've heard of this sort of thing. It's happened not too long ago. I think it was like a month or two ago in Russia. The Russian government also called for antitrust and basically, it was last September, sorry, and found Google guilty of antitrust. And at the time, it was like, oh yeah, well, that's just Russia, whatever. EU is kind of a bigger story.
Well, yeah, it is a much bigger.
But is this also the Microsoftification of Google now?
Yeah, that's what I was.
Kind of,
that's what I'm always thinking when I hear these stories.
Yeah.
But oh my gosh, it's such a political, such a political thing. This spans beyond just technology.
The EU is crazy. I think.
They're extremely.
They're not crazy.
Like we think our
You're
government.
not getting the EU's vote this week.
Yeah.
Trust me, I'm not in no time anytime soon. Okay, I get it. Europe websites use cookies. Like I don't need that overlay every time I go to a European website. Like the
just so you know.
Yeah, this site uses cookies. Like whatever, dude. But I think that some of the antitrust stuff is good to keep the companies like Google and Microsoft and Apple in check.
Yeah.
But I think the EU takes it a step too far as always. And then the question is that how the negotiations will be to dial it back or what the end result will be. But to be honest, if you look at what began the downfall of Microsoft, it was probably the EU legislation. It was the whole unbundling of IE and all that.
Because how do you do it in one major area like the EU and have it not affect your business elsewhere? And that's a big consideration here. Often in this kind of argument or this kind of debate, people kind of fall back on the fact that, Android, it's not like Android's the only game in town. There's iOS, blah, blah, blah. Well, the EU actually sees Apple's iOS not as a direct competitor to Android. They say iOS is not a licensable operating system. And as such, Android owns 95% of the EU's licensed mobile OS market. And
that sounds like a personal problem.
Big deal.
That's one way to skin a cat. They're right. That makes sense. I don't know if I agree with it, but to quote the great Obi-Wan Kenobi, from a certain point of view, that makes a lot of sense. Right? So.
I don't know. I think that I hate to say that I think there's a little bit of something here that the EU is kind of pointing out, and it's not like we haven't heard this for months leading up to this, but I guess the other side of this is the fact that Android has an open source version of the OS that doesn't include kind of the Google apps and services. The fact that Google does offer that. Is that enough of a concession? Like that's an option. That's an alternative for people who don't want to roll with Google's thing. But they're prohibited to go that route if they decide on any other devices to go the official Google route.
I think it's perfectly fine concession because it gives the choice up to the manufacturers and the people that are making the software for their phones.
Yeah.
So it's really up to them whether or not they want to stick with Google or not. And why wouldn't they let them stick with Google? There's more support. That route.
Right. Well, and that's another big reason why Google says it does what it's doing. They released an update, a blog update, pretty much the same day that the charges came, and they basically said that manufacturers can choose to install their apps on these devices, so they're not keeping those apps off, but of course their apps are there first and foremost. That the free state of Android is basically offset by including those apps and services on the devices, so they're able to actually offer it for free because those exist. And they don't say this, but not to mention just the fact that a lot of people want Google services on their device.
Google
so
services
from
over
a
Apple
manufacturer's
services.
perspective, you the perception I would imagine would be you would be hindering the potential success of your device if you don't. But maybe that's why it's an antitrust
Do you
thing to begin
penalize
with.
a company for doing something so well?
Yeah,
I mean,
I know
the
that's
thing.
always that's always the
And do
trick
you
in
want
something
like
this.
awful knockoffs like what's going on in China?
Right.
Because I am sorry,
So
I don't like the model of what's going on in China with like I'm not a believer of that market and what's going on with Android over there, and I would not want to see that happening in Europe.
Right. And is it because there's no viable other choice, and they're saying it's because of the antitrust practices? But let's say this all goes through, and there still isn't like it just doesn't make sense. It's not like there's some alternative that they're crushing. Like they're not keeping anybody from succeeding. They're just
They
doing
are not keeping Apple from succeeding.
Yeah, they're just doing
Absolutely
a
not.
very effective job, and honestly, I think
Yeah.
that the distinction between iOS and Android, while from a certain point of view does make sense, is kind of BS too. So
Yeah.
I mean, because if you think about it, it's not like Microsoft is out there screaming that they can't get a foothold in Europe because of Android.
They're actually surviving because of the people that they have in Europe. They actually have a market in Europe that is somewhat flourishing for their few Nokia phones.
Yeah.
So, and even BlackBerry was like really strong in Europe for quite a long time. PBM was very popular among the youths.
And then everything changed.
And then everything changed. But that's what happens if you don't innovate.
Yeah.
So maybe the EU should go, why do you guys suck so much?
Would a world
Just kidding.
in
Nobody
a-
sucks.
Stupid American.
That's a terrible, terrible thing to say. Nobody sucks.
would a world where Google is forced to offer to remove the clause that people, that OEMs can release a device that has Google services, but also release a device that doesn't? I mean, is that a bad world to live in?
I don't know.
think that's a bad world. I don't think that's
Yeah,
a
it's
bad
not a
world.
bad
That might be what we end up with.
I just
And
don't
I don't
want
know
to
if that's
see.
necessarily a horrible outcome.
I just don't want to see something happen where Google will like lose too much control because of this, and then the
Right.
entire platform is just completely forked into all these
Yeah,
different
well, and that's a
and
big
then
part
it's
of
just
what
gonna
they're
make it
also
absolutely
saying.
terrible.
What if when you're in Europe and you open up your phone, a window comes over telling you that this phone uses cookies, and you have to close
Can't we just do that? I'd be fine with that. If you want to pop up, that's fine. I'll
Yeah.
deal with it. I already deal with permissions now on Marshmallow.
I know.
so.
I love the permissions. I love
Yeah.
dealing with those because now I understand
okay.
them when they appear, and I
They're
deal with them once,
great.
and then I move
yeah,
on.
Yeah.
Yes, it's
happy with it.
understandable, but then if you have an app that's like crashing a lot and it's still like asking for permissions, but it keeps crashing because it's asking for permissions.
I actually just had that. I don't remember when I was setting up the Robin. I had a phone ask me for. I had an app ask me for permissions, but it was like. It was like a game or something. This wants access to your phone and your contacts. I was like, no, I don't like. It was weird. I should have noted what it was, but I forgot
Yeah.
what it was because I'm old.
Yeah,
but
it happens more often
But
than-
it was nice because I was able to say deny,
exactly.
deny.
Denied.
Yeah.
Denial.
Yeah.